Argument.
And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. And Book TV is in London, interviewing some authors. And joining us now is Professor A.C. Grayling, the author of more than 30 books. His most recent is called The God Argument. Professor Grayling, in that book, you write, "The burdens of religion are both social and political." What do you mean by that?
Well, we need only look really across the landscape of history to see how divisive, how many conflicts, how many difficulties are created by divisions among people of religious outlook. The burden there is not just an historical one, it's also contemporary. When we look across, for example, the Middle East and South Asia, we see these difficulties too, and they happen in our own societies. And so there is a great burden. And one thing that I wanted to argue for in that book was a different way of thinking about the ethical, which is to say, all those questions we ask ourselves about how we're to relate to one another, what our responsibilities are, how we should choose lives that are good and flourishing, so that they don't cause those divisions.
Well, Professor, hasn't religion helped to define what good and moral is?
People say this. The young religions of the world, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, and I say young because, of course, we look back across 2,500, 3,000 years perhaps, but they are young. They've changed the way that people relate to the world and to one another quite dramatically. If you look at the ethical systems that they embody, all the very best of them, the adjurations to care for the widows and the orphans, to treat our fellow human beings as if they were our brothers and sisters, are common to all the great ethical outlooks, including the secular, the non-religious ones. And insofar as they have anything particular or special to them, they do tend to generate disagreements with the other ethical outlooks. And so that's, I think, where some of the problem arises.
Back to the God argument. Like magic and astrology, you write, religion dates from mankind's less educated and knowledgeable early history and has been superseded by advances in our understanding of the world and ourselves.
I think that's really obvious in a way from when one looks at what animism is, and this is a term that applies to the sort of pre-revealed religions of the world, and which were probably the dominant outlook for many, many tens of thousands of years before our own historical period. And what you see there is an attempt by human beings to give some explanation, to provide some conceptual framework, really, for thinking about the world. The one thing that they understood was agency. They understood their own capacity to pick up a stone and throw it, or to pour water, or to make a noise. And so they thought that everything that happened in nature must have an agency behind it, that the wind, the thunder, the rain must be caused by something rather similar to themselves. And that is a kind of proto-science, and it's an attempt to provide this explanatory framework of ideas. And if you look at how ideas about religion have changed over the millennia, you notice that whereas the dryads and the nymphs and the sea gods and the rain gods were present in nature, bit by bit they moved away as we understood more about nature. They went to the mountaintops, for example, Olympus and elsewhere. In the Old Testament we have a burning bush on the mountaintop and a pillar of smoke by day, which sounds like a volcano god. And then the gods went off into the sky, Ra, and the Egyptians saw their god every day burning in the sky, the sun. But now, of course, the gods are beyond space and time altogether, and this, I think, marks something of the horizon of the advance of knowledge.
Haven't we been through these cycles before in our history, though, where we think science will supersede religion and other things?
Well, I don't think science is ever going to supersede our ethical, our literary, our humanistic interests, and it doesn't claim to do so. If you talk to somebody working in one of the advanced areas of science, particle physics or biology, they're concerned with a particular range of natural phenomena and the attempt to understand them. The things that we really value in our lives, our affections and our connectedness with one another, all the social and political questions which are of very great importance in organising and running society, these are not matters that an empirical scientist can do more than contribute to, can give us help with understanding and with facts. But we, all of us, have to be reflective, and we all have to be part of the great conversation of mankind, where we come to some decisions and compromises about how we live together.
Professor Grayling, in the God argument, you argue for humanism. What is humanism?
Humanism is an attitude rather than a doctrine. It's an attitude that says if we're to think most fruitfully about our human relationships, our social and individual relationships, we've got to start from our most generous and sympathetic understanding of human nature and the human condition. Now, the human condition, of course, is something which is richly explored by literature and history and philosophy. Understanding human nature is much more difficult, because it is so various and complex. And indeed, it's a lifetime's work to try to understand oneself, let alone other people, given all the diversity of others from oneself. But that is where we have to start in order to be able to work with the grain of human nature and to try to be tolerant, to give other people the margin of possibility for themselves to find lives that feel good to them. I mean, one very key thing here is this, that for most of history, most people, and alas still today, have been told that there is one right way to live, one great truth, one answer to the question of what it all means. And what the Enlightenment of the 18th century reminded us, actually, from classical antiquity is that there is a great diversity in human talent for good lives. There's a great diversity among human beings. I'm often put in mind of what George Bernard Shaw said when he was meditating on the Golden Rule, which says, do to others as you would have them do to you. And he said, under no circumstances should you do to others what you'd like them to do to you, because they may not like it. And this is a very deep point. It's a deep point because it asks us to treat others in their individuality and particularity. And to do that, one has to have some insight into human nature, the best we can get into this very, very complex matter. And that's why the demand is on us to be thoughtful, to be observant, to be educated, I mean, in the sense that we become truly reflective about the great range of human possibilities. And that is the basis of a humanistic view in ethics, because it starts from the human, at the human scale, looking for the things in human life that tend to flourishing.
Are humans innately moral?
I think they are. We are intrinsically social animals, essentially social animals. We need one another. We need to give and receive affection. If you look at our newspapers, they're full of atrocity and tragedy and conflict and war. But that's because those things are news. I mean, in every town, city, village of the world, every single day of the year, there are millions of acts of courtesy, kindness, common friendship, people just getting on. The fact that the buses run and the electricity comes on mainly in most advanced economies is because people are doing what they said they would do. That's the majority story. So we are, I think, fundamentally well disposed towards one another. And if you wanted an illustration of why one would think that, suppose you were walking down the street and you saw somebody ahead of you onto whom a great pile of bricks was about to fall, unbeknownst to her. What would you do? You wouldn't say, this is going to be interesting. You'd say, look out. You'd cry out to them. And it wouldn't matter who they are, what their ethnicity, what their religion, what their political views, just another human being, and your instinct would be to help them.
Back to your book, The God Argument. Freedom from coercive ideology is both a human right and a fundamental civil liberty.
There's no question of it. And I think about the major religions of the world and the major political ideologies of the Stalinist and Nazi kind. They share one thing in common. That is, they have a view that they know how things ought to be organized, and everybody's got to sign up for it. This is the one thing they have in common, this structure of ideology, which forces onto people a particular view and a particular practice. And I think anybody would agree that your right to freedom of expression, to self-determination, to privacy, these are things that you would want to defend very robustly against, let us say, a totalitarian regime like the Stalinist. But insofar as the Stalinist regime shares with a major religious outlook, like the Catholic Church of Torquemada during the Inquisition, or like the Calvinists of Geneva at the time of Calvin himself, you would see that exactly the same thing applies. Freedom from that kind of coercion over thought and practice is a fundamental human right. And so one thing I argue in the book is that we should refocus our thinking a bit about this. Of course, people can choose to believe what they like, and of course religious movements and churches have every right to exist and put their point of view, but no right to coerce people into sharing their point of view. And alas, most of history and too much of the world today is still under the government of coercion in that respect.
This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and we are in London, and we're talking with various authors while we're here. Today joining us is Professor Anthony Grayling. The God Argument is his most recent book. Professor, while we're taping this interview, a new pope is being chosen. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, to me personally, it's an irrelevance. It's a little bit of theatre. It has a comic aspect to it, but it also has a serious aspect, which is, of course, that there are many hundreds of millions of people who regard themselves as being Roman Catholics, who will therefore be influenced by the sorts of policies that the new pope comes up with. Are priests going to be able to marry? Will there be a change of view about contraception? Will the moral teaching of the Church become more liberal, or will it remain rather authoritarian? And these are matters that impact on people's lives. Principally, by the way, since the great majority of members of the Roman Catholic Church use contraception, let us say, they are at odds with the official teaching of their Church, and unfortunately obliged, in the interests of their own children, in the interests of their own lives, to embrace hypocrisy, which is what ultimately it comes down to. That's a hard word, but alas, it's true. And I think people would like to live with consistency, be able to feel that they live with some degree of integrity in their lives. But the way that these very ancient doctrines apply to modern lives does cause a great deal of distortion, and that's one example.
With regard to humanism, you talk about different legislation that can happen, such as drug legalization. Why is that a humanistic approach?
Well, in